Hello, students. I, uh, I'm here again. This is for the History 1500 class. This will be a lecture, probably the second lecture I would have given on the week of April 6th to April 10th. So that's essentially where we're at. Once again, I'm wearing a tie. Once again, I'm trying to brag, to actually show you I know how to tie a tie. A skill that I picked up many years ago, which I can't remember how to do it. It has to be automatic. If I thought about it, I couldn't do it. I don't have a little bighorn tie. You can see maybe I got a few horses here, which is by a river. That's close enough. Little Bighorn took place near a river. Anyway, what we're talking about here is we're starting in the Middle Ages. Technically speaking, Islam is an issue that took place during the Middle Ages. But we're going back to Europe now. And I want to talk about a few issues that we often associate with the Middle Ages. The question I have right here in the lecture, as you can see, is, was there a Dark Age? See, sometimes we refer to the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. In other words, is a time frame where virtually nothing is going on. Now, that is a good definition of Dark Age, is it not? Nothing intellectual, nothing culturally. We have already met an example of a Dark Age, and that's Dark Age Greece, where, remember, the Greeks even lost the ability to write. The Mycenaean Greeks could write Linear B, as you all know. But after all, later on, they lost the ability to write. So actually what we have is a development later on of borrowing the alphabet, as I've already mentioned. The Greeks have to reinvent the ability to write. That's extremely important for civilization. But we are talking about Europe. Was there a Dark Age? If we want to say the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages are the same era, we would largely say, when we're the Dark Age, it would be from the fall of Rome. Remember, I've discussed earlier that the fall of Rome there's no real perfect date for it. Some historians like one date, some like another. But somewhere in the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire, the political structure of the Roman Empire, is lost to the Renaissance in Italy, the Dark Age. The Renaissance in Italy actually starts about, and once again, there's not a complete consensus here, but nowadays we're usually saying that the Renaissance started in Italy around 1350. In other words, that's the middle of the 14th century. The rest of Europe is still in the Middle Ages until about 1500, when the aspects of the Renaissance, art and literature, tend to go north of the Alps into the other countries, including Germany, France, and England. But that's beyond the scope of this course, because this course ends in 1500 AD, as you know. So, if you're talking about outside Italy, it's roughly the 5th century to about 1500 AD, outside of Italy. Well, why do we call this the Dark Age? Why has it been called the Dark Age? Remember, I said that the Enlightenment hates the Middle Ages. Not everybody. Voltaire and Immanuel Kant have a tendency to speak very disparaging of the Middle Ages. And as I've often liked to assert, in many respects, we are the children of the Middle Ages. We are the children of the Enlightenment. So many of the basic assumptions of the Enlightenment are the kinds of things that in our society today. They hate the Middle Ages because they thought it was dominated by the church. That is true to a certain extent, but not true to a complete extent. And they think or thought that the Middle Ages was dominated by the church. In other words, it's dominated by superstition. It's dominated by a lack of progress in society. It's dominated by an intellectual milieu that looks far too closely at Scripture and church traditions. So it holds back human progress. Therefore, it's all bad. You simply take the whole thing and throw it out. Well, let's take a look at it and see why this kind of theory has to be modified. Early Middle Ages, High Middle Ages. Let's read it correctly. High Middle Ages, we usually say 1000 to 1300, depending on exactly where we're at when we want to kick in with the Renaissance. We could push these numbers back a little bit farther. But the High Middle Ages are quite advanced, shall we say. Now, as you well know, I'm a big fan of art. Oh, I love art. And I'm going to say that the Gothic, which is very, very much in its heyday during the High Middle Ages, is something we should admire, not something we should disparage. And we will talk about this later on in the class. Technology, I'm going to make a big deal about technology. I have 2 lectures on technology. If I have time, I will give them both to you. But as far as technology is concerned, we can say that there's a lot of advances going on here as well. From the perspective of the 20th and 21st centuries, the time frame in which we live, we can argue very strongly that technology has made an enormous difference in our lives, enormous difference in the human condition. We're living in a brilliant technological age, but the High Middle Ages also has a lot of technology. So it's hard to say they're backward in this respect. Another very exciting aspect, I think, that we see in the High Middle Ages and also late Middle Ages is advancement in human freedom, human liberty, the right of people to be free, the right of people to choose occupations, the right of people to choose what they do with their lives. These are areas that are much advanced because of the High Middle Ages. Quite frankly, historians say, I'm sorry, the late Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages don't work. This is not a dark age. But then that leads us to the early Middle Ages. Once again, the dates can be debated. However, can we roughly say the early Middle Ages would be roughly 500, the year 500, to about 1000 AD. This is a rough time frame, no doubt about that at all. We'll talk about a few of these issues. I've already mentioned the Saracens. We'll also mention the Magyars and the Avars, and perhaps most dominantly in the Central and Western Europe is actually the Vikings. These are mean people. These are rough people. These are people that push you around. These are people that are destructive and they run over areas. If we want to say that the early Middle Ages is dark because of violence, we can make a case for that. On the other hand, is this the only really violent era in human history? There are others, but we don't tend to call them dark ages. So yes, if you're talking about a dark age as being a rough era, certain aspects that would apply here. But there are other things going on. So let's look at what else is going on to see how well we should call this dark. A definition of dark age is that there is not much learning going on. Can we say the early Middle Ages is really not quite as advanced intellectually as the high or late Middle Ages or of Rome? Yes, we can say that. It's probably true. But remember, unlike the Greek Dark Ages, there is actually a lot going on. And of course, these people do not lose the ability to read and write. That never goes down. If we look at technology, there are aspects of technology which do exist in the Roman Empire that survive. In fact, one architectural historian, which I've read, argued that we don't lose really any technology going from Rome to the early Middle Ages. The Middle Ages likes to build a lot more with stone and mortar than with concrete, which the Romans are very good at. But they really haven't lost the ability to build. So technologically speaking, at least in that respect, this doesn't really go downhill. Let's look at learning. There's much learning at this time frame. In the church, largely Italy, the church has church conferences, The church has church councils. The church is working on liturgies. So within the framework of the religion itself, there's a lot going on in the church. Jumping ahead just a little bit, we're going to see the springboard to the intellectual climate of the High Middle Ages actually coming from the church as well. But we're still in the early Middle Ages. So we got church in Italy, Spain. Yeah, there's some learning going on. Even before the Muslims arrive, the Moors, we do have a lot of learning going on in Spain. There are, shall we say, quasi-Roman writers still writing about intellectual matters. This is not an explosion of wonderful learning. On the other hand, it does exist. Ireland, there's a book that came out a number of years ago stating how the Irish saved civilization. And I've read the book. The basic argument is this, that Ireland in the monasteries in the early Middle Ages copied books. They kept the thread of learning alive. And without that, maybe much would have been lost. There is something to that argument. The Irish monks not only keep learning alive, but when we also talk about art in the Middle Ages, we will discuss some of the most beautiful books that's ever been created. In this case, I'm talking about the Book of Kells. And the Book of Kells was created during the early Middle Ages in Ireland. So the Irish would fit very nicely. And much of the Irish learning does not stay in Ireland because later on they send missionary efforts into England and other places in Europe. So Ireland is an area of learning. England, we see the Lindisfarne Gospels here. We see the Venerable Bede writing church histories at this time frame. It's hard to argue that it's completely a wasteland. France, we'll come back to France when we're talking about Charlemagne. But Charlemagne will foment and push learning. So we have various areas of learning. However, there's a question, how much of that do we really have? Sometimes our historians have argued the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages, are only dark to us. Well, that is a good argument because their statement is this. A lot is going on, but we have some bad boys come in, like the Magyars and the Saracens and the Vikings, that destroy much of the monasteries. So some of the learning is lost. That's probably true. Do we know how much was there that was actually destroyed? We know enough to say that there's something going on. We say much lost, but we do have enough information to indicate there was plenty going on. Another aspect, get down here a little ways, another aspect of civilization, we say would be superstition. Now, going back to the Enlightenment says the entire Middle Ages are superstitious. Perhaps by our standards, they are superstitious. But can we say it's not as superstitious as portrayed? An aspect of superstition is, of course, the belief in evil spirits and that kind of thing. And we do hear in the Middle Ages about people believing in little things like trolls. And we do hear about leprechauns. In fact, leprechauns are still talked about somewhat in Ireland. They're more of a comic thing than they were initially. Initially, they're kind of little things that kind of pick on you and they steal things and they hide some of your merchandise. However, if we compare the early Middle Ages with Rome, we find there are a few things about the Roman Empire that leave a lot to be desired. They believe that cemeteries are haunted. They believe that there are evil powers when you go across a bridge or when you go through a crossroads. We would say, well, why would they think that? Well, can you fall off a bridge? Can the bridge perhaps collapse? Is it slightly more dangerous to go across a bridge than it is to be on the level? Well, probably not. How about crossroads? Well, if you're going to have an accident, of course, you can take your chariot or your cart and you can roll it off, of course. But if you got somebody with a really good horse taking it on down through the intersection, and you're there with your donkey going across, and he runs into you, well, that's more dangerous usually than if you're on the straightaway. But see, superstition has them thinking that these areas are haunted. Is this true in the Middle Ages as well? Yeah, to a certain extent. However, let's take a look at another aspect of superstition, and that is a belief in witches. We hear about this a lot. It makes good not science fiction. It makes good fiction. The evil witches are around and they're taking over. A lot of times we rather blanketly state that there's a belief in witches in the Middle Ages. Well, there is a belief in witches in the Middle Ages. I'll address more of that in just 1 minute. But the witch craze, where we are literally coming into villages and killing a large percentage of women. In fact, if we can believe our studies about the witch craze in modern Europe, there were actually a few villages in Switzerland and 1 or 2 in Germany that were down to like 1 woman or no women at all. So hunting these people down, the famous witch trials where you take women and you torture them for confessions. That's really the modern world. Usually the modern world witch craze, we usually say, starts after 1500. Gets worse by half century until we get to about 1650 when the witch craze starts to burn itself out and the number of witches that are persecuted or hunted down drop off dramatically until it virtually disappears in the 18th century. Well, okay, but is there belief in witches in the Middle Ages? Yes. Remember Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is fighting for the French, and during the 100 Years' War, the English don't like that. When the English get a hold of her, they want to discredit her as much as they can, and one of the accusations is that she's in league with the devil, in other words, she's a witch. And as you might know, she was born in 1431, so there's a belief in witches. However, in the 15th century, we're talking like 1450 to 1500 in Germany, which later on is going to be one of the focal points of the witch craze. We only know of several witches, literally just 2 or 3. They're actually persecuted in those years. Let's go back to the early Middle Ages. Both the church and the state do everything they can to discourage a belief and practice of persecuting witches. The church said that there are no witches, that anybody who believes in witches are subject to the judgment of the church, which can be damaging to your soul. Now, if there was no belief anywhere in witches, it's very likely the church would have not tried to make that statement. So clearly there is a belief, but the church is trying to destroy that belief. Means they're using their power very strongly in that direction. The state. We'll mention Charlemagne later, but one of the things Charlemagne said was that if anybody persecutes somebody for being a witch, that person is subject to the affairs of the state. In other words, you're breaking laws and you can be punished for that. Once again, it would be not necessary to make these laws unless there were a belief in witches and people were practicing coming after these people. Let's say this, it's the modern world that is more superstitious as far as witches are concerned. And the early Middle Ages is not nearly as superstitious as portrayed. No historian has actually been able to give us a good explanation as to why it is that the early Middle Ages is more rational in this case than is early modern Europe. Well, we did talk earlier about violence. Remember I said, violence can be an aspect, shall we say, of thinking an area is dark. Well, we can do that. But can we say the early Middle Ages is not the only time frame we have violence and persecution and war? No, there are other time frames. Let's once again pick on the modern world. It's an interesting comparison. Modern imperialism, we can actually say that as Europe expands outside of Europe during the age of exploration. Remember Christopher Columbus, 1492. And we have colonies that are established in Latin America, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and it can be pretty awful. Sometimes we call these the Indian Holocaust, where the Spaniards and Portuguese brought in diseases, not necessarily on purpose, but they did. The most vicious was smallpox in their areas, their Indians. Over a period of time, sometimes it's just a few decades, where they lost 90% of their population. The Europeans come in and they also enslave people. They cut off Indians' hands, and they do a very, very good job in destroying civilizations. Well, this is nothing to brag about. Modern imperialism, usually we say this starts in the 19th century, where in, let's say, in Africa, in the late 19th century, 10% of Africa was owned by European countries. By 1914, 90% is owned by European countries. And they're not very nice about conquering these native peoples. Rapid-fire artillery, rapid-fire high-powered rifles, and the infamous machine gun make a great deal of difference in conquest. In other words, you come in and mow people down. And when this is done, sometimes people are worked to death. Sometimes they're enslaved. Sometimes populations go down dramatically. See, these are barbaric actions. And can we say modern wars, particularly World War I, World War II, Korea and Vietnam are not jokes either. Millions of people dying in all of these wars, World War I and World War II. We're talking deaths in the tens of millions. And I haven't even talked about 20 to 30 million that died in the Great Leap Forward in China. That's early 1960s. Can we say 1914 to about 1964 is one of the most vicious half centuries in the history of humanity? And I haven't even mentioned genocide, the Armenian genocide, the genocide we call the Holocaust and killing Jews. So we can say the early 20th century has a lot to be embarrassed about. Well, who's more barbaric? Can we say if the people in the early Middle Ages had the technical means, they had machine guns, for example, they would have done as many damaging things to their people as we did in the 20th century? Yeah, that could easily be. But on the other hand, we did it and they didn't. Are they more barbaric than we are? That's an open question. Let me make an interesting comment here. Back when I was growing up, remember I was a kid who was raised around the idiot box. We spent an awful lot of time watching television. There was a late night comedian by the name of Steve Allen. This is about when I was in junior high school, so I remember watching him quite a bit. I was amused by the kinds of things he did. And a lot of his were what we call shtick, or just being silly, pie in the face, those kind of things. But Steve Allen was actually more than that. Steve Allen was something of an intellectual. Now, you normally would think that a clown and an intellectual are really not the same people, but in his case, it was a fact. And I think this is very clever what he did. For a number of years, he created a program called the Meeting of the Minds. He was a pretty good historian, I think. And what he would do is to have a roundtable discussion. He's acting like yourself. I'm Steve Allen. And tonight we want to invite various people to come in and talk. Got Oliver Cromwell. You got Plato. Boy, would you like to have a conversation with Plato? I would love that. Steve Allen did his research. The kinds of things that people said were the kinds of things that he has in the dialogue here, the kinds of things that either they said themselves or, shall we say, exemplify part of their attitudes and their character. Totally fascinating. Various people from various historical time frames. Well, one time he had Attila the Hun come in. Oh, this guy was good actor. He was Oriental in his aspect, not terribly tall, well built. This guy obviously pumped iron. comes in. He walks a little bit, maybe like he's been on horseback too long. Oh, did a good job. Kind of has this Fu Manchu kind of mustache. And see if I can find something of the minds. Find something about that and give you an idea of the images. Some of these people. This is not what I'm looking for. This was a program essentially back in the, so I recall it was broadcast in the 70s. We have a number of people here. I'm not sure who this all represents. His wife, he had his wife in a lot of these things. I think he has her down at Cleopatra at one time. See if that's correct. And, having little discussions, going back and forth. Some of the banter is really quite brilliant. And I think they did a very, very good job in some cases. Anyway, let's go back to this Attila the Hun. This is a fool's errand, but I'll try to try it as well. Do we have Attila the Hun here? No. In any event, I had this guy come in, and Steve Allen said, "Oh, you're this and that." And by darned, Attila, it's a real pleasure to meet you here, because after all, you're one of the great barbarians. That set Attila off. Attila says, "Wait a minute. He turned to Steve Allen and he says, "How many people were killed in World War II?" Steve Allen acts like he doesn't know. And Attila says, "There were 40 million. Poor Attila, the numbers are in dispute nowadays. A lot of times we're thinking that there's actually a lot more people killed in the Second World War than 40 million. But the time frame, that was a standard number. 40 million people killed in the Second World War. And after Attila said that, yes, about 40 million people killed in the Second World War. I will not be called a barbarian by the 20th century. That's an interesting insight. Something I've never forgotten. Well, what's my final take on using the term Dark Ages? Sometimes I do this when I'm just being absolutely stupid. I'll say something goes wrong, I get a flat tire or something. I'll say I haven't had so much fun since the Dark Ages. I don't really mean that. My point is this. The term Dark Ages is misleading. And no matter how we define Dark Ages, there are reasons to believe that might not be the case. I don't object to using the term Dark Ages. I do, however, like you to understand what you're talking about when you use the term. Let's go on and talk about something else. It also happens in the early Middle Ages. So I mentioned earlier, I have 2 technology lectures. Let's look at the one that I associate with the early Middle Ages. In other words, this is largely 400 or 500 AD to about 1000 AD. What is our definition of technology? Well, technology is using objects, means mechanical means, if you will, to manipulate the environment to live better. Well, sure. So let's look at what we're talking about. Let me ask you a simple question. Why would you have more technical advances in the early and high Middle Ages, late Middle Ages as well, than you had during Rome? I gave you an answer to this in an earlier lecture. Because if you have a society that's substantially slave, a very large percentage of people are slaves, they will not have incentive to invest in technology. You see, if you're a slave and you improve something, you do not benefit. If you're a slave owner, you really have no incentive either, because to make your life better, everything's being done for you already by the slaves. Can we say, therefore, that as we look at free societies where people do have the opportunity to make their lives better, that there's much more likely to have advances in technology? Well, some of these dates are approximate. In other words, We're not sure exactly when they took place. About the time when Rome was declining, we do see early indications that lye soap had been developed. Lye soap is different than the kind of cleansing materials that the Romans tended to have. Remember I talked about olive oil. Put olive oil in your skin. The dirt gets kind of in solution and you scrape it off. If you happen to live next to Vesuvius and you have pumice, and you can take the pumice, it's somewhat gritty on your fingers, and that'll help scrape the dirt off. But it's not until the invention of a true soap that we have a chemical means of destroying dirt. As you all know, true soap is essentially this. It is a fat molecule that is incomplete. In other words, the baking process has separated some of the molecules. Since the chemical bonds are incomplete, they want to chemically bond with other objects that make them complete. You put them in solution, in other words, water, and then the soap itself will actually chemically bond with the dirt on your skin. At least as important as that is, it will chemically bond with the chemicals in bacteria and kill them. Of course, nobody knows about bacteria at this time frame. Nobody knows it's killing them, but it does. And then insects, the smaller the insects, the more effective it is, like mites. But insects are a problem on people's bodies because they also lay eggs. So the soap will react and kill insects, at least the larvae and eggs. Whoa, talk about a change. Some historians have called the invention of soap actually the greatest social invention of all time. I guess by social they mean you smell better, and of course, certainly you will. Lye soap is something that I'm somewhat familiar with. When I was a kid, Mom would cook dinner, good old greasy meat. And Mom would save the fat. The fat, of course, would float up on top of the pan. She would spoon it off, and she kept it in containers. And when we went down to see Grandma, Grandma would take the soap, I said that wrong, would take the fat, and then she would bake it into lye soap. She would add lye to it. And then on our next visit, we would come down, and we had these big chunks of lye soap. And Mom would, when we were doing our laundry, go down the washing machine, and Mom would get a knife and scrape off some of the lye soap into the water. If she had a really small chunk of it, didn't want to scrape it off, I remember watching her toss some of these things into the washing machine. So as far as I know, it worked pretty good. And I think our clothing was actually fairly clean. Well, this allows for greater hygiene. This makes sure that people can live bug-free, more bacteria-free, and therefore have less problems with disease. This is a major advancement. Well, how do people grow crops? If you have more food, does that make your life better? Of course it does. And let's look at crop rotation. This is when this is getting, that's two-field. This is when this gets a little bit awkward. As you well know, I do occasionally write on the board. And I can't do that here, at least I don't have a chalkboard handy. So I can't do that right now. But a lot of times what I will do is this. I'll draw or usually a rectangle on the board. And I will say this is how crops were grown in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We call it the two-field system. I guess this would be no. The two-field system would be more like this. One field grows wheat. Remember, most people live on grain. And one field is fallow every year. Wheat is a challenging plant because it has a tendency to denigrate the soil. In other words, it has a tendency to make soil fertility go down. If you simply take your land and plant it year after year, in wheat, you're going to have a problem because the fertility is going to go down and yields are going to go down. One way to keep up the yields is crop rotation. This year you plant, and the same year you have this area over here, which is fallow, which is not planted. You do tend to plow this over. One of the reasons why you do that is to kill weeds, so keep the weeds from being as strong next year. And you can dump your garbage out here and those kind of things as well. They have a tendency to help the soil build up. Some of the nitrogen in the soil actually comes from the atmosphere. Over time, this will still be somewhat challenging to keep up high yields. On the other hand, this is a mechanism by which you can keep planting the same areas for lengthy periods of time. Well, but you see how inefficient this is. Half your land is not being cultivated at any given time. We think about 800 AD. Remember, we're still near the Middle Ages. We think about 800 AD, where in agriculture, largely France, they start to develop the three-field system, which is somewhat superior to two-field. What we have, and this little guy right here is probably our best representation of this. I notice he's having a good day. He's quite a happy little man. I'm glad to see him out there. So rather than having 50-50 wheat and fallow, now we have three fields. 1/3 is still fallow. But what do we have over here now? We have wheat. We still want to eat a lot of bread. This third field system we tend to call legumes. Legumes is actually peas and beans. Peas and beans are very good for you. If you eat wheat by itself, yeah, that's good for you, but it's not a complete diet. You don't have enough vitamins. You need to eat other things like vegetables you can find maybe someplace else. But as a major crop, peas and beans are very helpful. And with this crop rotation system, and you change, fallow might be over here next year, wheat might be here, legumes might be over there. You can keep up soil fertility, and now you have increased the amount of land that is productive. More nutrition, more land that's available. That's very, very, very valuable. Now, if you want to take this beyond our time frame, which we would in the next course, talking about the agricultural revolution, you get more elaborate rotation schemes in which eventually you do away with fallow at all, which makes an awful lot of difference in food production. But can we say, going in the Middle Ages from the ancient world, the three-field system is a big improvement. But you also have to have the ability to manipulate the soil better. You see, if you're in the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, good examples, you can have what we call the scratch plow. And I've already mentioned plows in other categories. You just simply have a stick, sometimes a little metal on the end of the stick, and you drag that through the ground. If the ground is relatively loose, if it's relatively a little bit sandy, this works fairly well. But if you go into Northern Europe, if you go into Britain, you go into France, where the soils are heavier, the scratch plow doesn't work very well because you simply cannot push it through the heavier soil. So you cannot farm there, you can't make use of it. The Romans, when the Romans go into, let's try this, go into places like France, they tend to use long lots. Let's see if I can give you an example of long lots. Well, good old Romans. Let's go down here. This might work fairly well. You have a river down here, and you have a tendency to farm near the river. You're asking why? Well, because of the shifting of the river. The land next to the river has a tendency to be a little bit more sandy, a little bit looser. So you can use it more effective with weaker plows, with the scratch plow. And so when the Romans go into France, which is one of the great agricultural areas in the world, as you well know, they cannot make use of it they settle along the rivers, along the Var, along the Rhone, along the Seine, and they really don't expand in a very real sense out to cultivate broader areas because they really don't have the technical means to do so. But in the Middle Ages, now we get the early Middle Ages, we get the heavy moldboard plow. Let's see if I can spell that correctly. The heavy moldboard plow, these are essentially modern plows, but we do have examples over here which include the Middle Ages. What is somewhat misleading about this is we have oxen here, and this man is plowing the field, and he has a plow right here. Maybe this is good enough for our purposes. The reason why I'm saying somewhat this misleading, because sometimes these plows were so heavy that you'd have to have not just a couple oxen, sometimes you'd have to have several teams of oxen. And the plow itself was on a relatively large cart. Late in the Middle Ages, you get this kind of thing. The moldboard plow will do this for you. Look at this. There's a knife that actually goes through the soil, and it cuts a furrow, I guess you'd call it that, cuts a path through the ground itself. If there's plants there, it cuts through it. Then the plow comes into that exact same path that was cut by this knife, and it is configured at an angle. So as it goes through the soil, it takes the soil, it picks it up and rolls it over. This is not a medieval moldboard plow. This is a modern plow. But you can see it does the same kind of thing. It takes the soil, it picks it up, and rolls it over. This plow goes deeper into the soil. It can bring up more nutrition, and it brings up more nutrition because it turns over more ground. This is very, very good. It's very effective in heavy soils. So now farming can move from long lots along the rivers up to the higher areas and be able to make better use of a larger section of the entire area. Remember, I have right here, Romans used long lots near rivers for sandy soils. Well, now you have a plow that has the ability to move the soil, but you have to have the ability to do so. In the ancient world, you can get your husband if you want to do that, and you can have him drag the scratch plow. And you do use animals as well. But if you're using this heavy moldboard plow, you have to have a different ability. In other words, you have to have more animal strength. Your husband's not going to be able to do it, even if he's a buff guy. You're going to have to be able to drag these things more effectively through the soil. Well, draft animals have been around for a long time. And let's say before you have the non-choking collar, what you have is an animal. Now, some of these animals are very powerful. An ox, as you know, is a bull that's been fixed, so he's more docile. But an ox is a pretty considerable animal. These are buff animals. So we get an ox up here for you. Now that is a pretty big animal. The strength of these animals is really quite remarkable. Notice this lady over here. So these animals are very, very effective, except you have to be able to use their strength properly. Before you have the non-choking collar, they usually just have a strap, a rope, sometimes leather, going around the animal's neck. Come around something like this, like a little bit like my tie. Well, the animal is hooked to the plow, and the animal starts pulling the plow through the soil, and there's work to be done. So when he needs to do more work, he gets in there, starts working a little bit. Well, then the rope, the cord around its neck, pulls against it, starts to choke it, can actually cut off your ability to breathe, your windpipe, and it can actually cut off the circulation of the blood to your head. This is very uncomfortable, and an animal can't press on it very long. So what an animal has to do, rather than keeping on doing this and choking, you simply back off. This limits the amount of work that can be done. Well, in advance in the Middle Ages, usually we say 6th to 8th centuries AD, where you get, can we see these guys a little bit here? This is actually a non-choking collar, a rigid collar, which we're familiar with in the American West. Let's see if I can give you a slightly better view of that. Get the non-choking collar here. Don't want a dog collar. Let's see what we've got. No. We'll try it and then give up. Oh, okay. I think this might work pretty well. Can you see that this is what the collar looks like? It is it's rigid. This is not like a cord that can choke you. This is actually, it's usually made out of wood. Sometimes you have leather around it, and this actually takes the, see that a little bit there. So when the animal needs to do more work and it starts to work harder, the pressure does not go to the neck and choke the animal. It actually goes to the collar. In other words, more or less to part of the shoulder, and the pressure goes onto the shoulder. So the animal now can use its entire strength to pull that plow. That is a big advantage in being able to pull these plow through heavy soils. So now we have the moldboard plow, and we have the ability now to have an animal make better use of the plows. In the ancient world, there is an idea of water doing work. There are a few times when the Romans actually taken springs and push it against the wheel and get the wheel to turn. I'm not going to say the idea is actually foreign to the Romans, but I am going to say that the the water mills, later windmills, do really come to their fore during the Middle Ages. The water mill was probably invented in the early Middle Ages. However, as we look at the development of the mills, the water mill, we're going to see a literal explosion after the year 1000 in the number of water mills that are around. The Romans, with all of their brilliance, never really mastered how to use gears. What is brilliant about what the medieval people are doing is they become expert at gears and able to use gears in numerous manners. Let's take a look at some of these. Okay, this is the classic watermill that many of you are familiar with. Watermills were quite popular to do work in the United States, particularly in the colonial period. It's not really until you get practical steam engines, which are first invented in the 18th century, but are not really heavily used until the 19th century, when you get away from these. But for many years, this is the way you get something done. Let's pull this up. I'd like to show you one in action. Maybe any event. What you need is just water flowing. Is this helpful? There's actually two ways of getting the wheel to move. You can have water flowing beneath it, as you can see, which what we're seeing right here, water flows beneath this and gets the wheel to turn. Flowing water in almost any respect will allow you to make energy. However, it's actually falling water, maybe there's a better one here, that is actually more efficient. This perhaps is a little bit better because now you have the weight of the water. It doesn't have to be a lot of water. In fact, some of these what I call sluices, are not terribly wide and not terribly deep, but you simply have water going over them. And this turns the wheel. Now the wheel down here is connected to a cam. And the cam takes the energy inside of the mill. With a system of gears, you can now have the energy do all kinds of work for you. One of the most popular is what we call the grist mill. The grist mill is actually when you take two stones, and usually the grain is placed at the top. There's a hole in the top stone. It comes in, but the two stones are turning. And as the grain comes in, wheat usually, it comes in here. And by mechanical means, the stones are being turned. And as it turns the wheat into a very fine powder. In other words, you call it flour. Before this time frame, when you ground grain, very often this would be your wife or your daughter, you get a stone and you take the wheat and you drop it on the stone. The young lady or the woman has another stone, and you simply take it and press to smash the grain down to a finer form of grain that you can use to make bread. If you have a bigger operation, you can have a bigger stone. And sometimes you would simply have a stone that is dragged by people, sometimes maybe by a donkey. And they would drag them in a circle, put the grain on the stones on the ground. Of course, the heavier stone is round. And then as the animal or person pulls that stone around, the weight of the stone going over the grain on the ground smashes it. Now, you can make bread this way as well, but you could well understand that this is not a fine flour. If you like fiber, there's a lot of fiber in this. This will go through you pretty easily. But in order to release the actual true nutrition, which we actually have in the grain, it is very nice to be able to break it down to a finer flour so you're more easily to absorb it and digest it. Can we say, therefore, that wheat helps people live longer, have more nutrition, be healthier because of the watermill? You can do a lot of things with this. You can actually change the energy if you want to, and you can actually have a hammer inside, and the hammer can mechanically be lifted up and drop. So you can actually use that as a forge. You can use this, take the energy and have the energy go up and down, or in a wheel if you want to, and then you can have a sawmill. One of the important things to remember about this is, almost exclusively before the advance of watermills, I should say, the only way you could do work was by physical labor. This is either manpower, woman power, and also animal power. This is the first time when you actually have a very large number, a very large amount, should say, of energy, which can do work for you. This is extremely important. Remember, I keep confusing windmills and watermills. Let's take a look at a windmill. How about a medieval windmill? Some of these exist today. Quite frankly, Holland is famous for having some of these still in operation. Many years ago, a friend of mine, happened to be a German, drove me around, and I said, I've never seen a windmill. So he showed me a windmill. It wasn't in operation. But essentially, it's the same idea. In the case of water, you have water creating energy. If you have a wind, and this works better, of course, in places like Holland, we have breezes coming off the North Sea at all times, then it will turn the wheel itself, and of course, with your cam and your gear system inside, you can use it to do various kinds of work. One of the reasons why the Dutch have a tendency to use it is that they can use it to pump water off the land. And of course, the water table is very high in Holland because they're very low. In fact, I believe like half of Holland is beneath sea level. So you do have water table problems, and this is highly effective. Some of the earlier forms, as a matter of curiosity, they actually have a pivot, some kind of a gear system down here, in which the mill can be turned to face the various directions of the wind. I consider that to be quite clever. So I'll give you a map of a medieval city. So I'll give you an idea of how common they were. This is good old medieval Zurich. Modern city is absolutely beautiful. If you ever get to Switzerland, Switzerland's a gorgeous place. I highly recommend it. Can we see this well? Maybe not as well as I would like you to be able to see it, but there's a lake here called Lake Zurich and a river coming out here called the Limmat. Can we see this any better? I'd like to get a larger version of that. And that helps a little bit. Notice what we have in the Limmat River here. We have the river flows in this direction, and you have poles that have been pounded into the riverbed. So as the water goes through here, it speeds up. And it goes through here at greater velocity, in other words, greater energy. Notice you have a wheel right here. This is a good place to push the wheel because the water is going faster, and you can use that to do more work. You see a mill here. You see one here literally in the middle of the river. One time, it's probably not this map, but I've actually tried to count. There's like maybe 3,000 people that lived in medieval Zurich. And of this number, you have about 13 known mills. So it's something, this is late Middle Ages, but this is something that was highly used at the time. Okay, water mills, yes. Work done by mechanical means. First time ever. Can we say better nutrition? Bingo. More food, better variety of food. We can say using grist mills, more nutrition has been able to escape. You can use it better. More cultivated land, well, you can move from the river bottoms up to the fields, some of the best agricultural area anywhere. You can use that as well. Land reclamation. I mentioned this already in a different context. Remember, I was talking about what the monks did in the Middle Ages, and that's land reclamation. Remember, among them was making the land in Holland useful, but you also are reclaiming land. You're draining land, draining marshes. Fens is in England, I believe. Let's make sure I'm correct on that. Okay, let's look at our map. There's an area you can see right around here, and unfortunately it's not very big. Let's try it again and see if I can give you a better representation. The Fens, very swampy land, was not being used during the Middle Ages. The Fens were drained, and now this is very good agricultural land. There's a lot of swampy land near rivers, particularly bends of rivers, and also during the Middle Ages. Some of these were also drained, so you can make better use of land. So that is land reclamation. So taking this all together, we have more nutrition, more cultivated land reclamation, more food, more people. And we would believe more food, more people, better nutrition. People are living longer, and therefore we have more success starting there in the Middle Ages. By the time you get the High Middle Ages, whoa, you got people everywhere in Europe, which we can discuss later if we get to it. Let's look at a few other things as well. The stirrup. The stirrup is something that's going to help you stay on the horseback. What is a stirrup? We have a saddle. Here's a Western saddle. And notice that we have the famous saddle horn. That's why we know it's a Western saddle. Why in the West they use a saddle horn? This is a place where you can wrap a rope. If you're roping them doggies, in other words cattle, or sheep. Of course, the cattlemen don't like the sheepmen; they don't get along very well. But anyway, you're trying to bring down the cattle. You might want to lasso the animal and pull it down. Well, if you hold on to that thing, the animal's going to pull you off the horse. But if you wrap it around the horn, in reality, that will hold it on so the animal can't get away. So this is a typical Western saddle. The stirrup is this. Notice there's a leather strap going down. This is a modern saddle. So the stirrup is made out of metal. In the Middle Ages, it would look a little bit more like this. Those where the strap was leather, and where you actually put your foot would be made out of wood. The stirrup has a little bit of a development. Apparently, initially, the Avars, people that came off of the Russian plain in the early Middle Ages, they would have straps on their saddles, and they come down. You put your big toe in those. I go, okay, well, that's better than not. But a stirrup, you can put your entire foot in there. Let's go back and look at Rome. We do read about Roman cavalry. We read about the cavalry that Hannibal used in the Second Punic War against the Romans. That's not cavalry as you and I think about it. Cavalry back then was not really a fighting platform. It was just a means by which you got your men to the battle quicker, and they literally got off to fight. Why wouldn't you fight from horseback? Well, I don't recommend you doing this because you're going to jiggle your brains. But if you ever get on a horse, try to ride one without a saddle, and where you have a little without stirrups. And how you can hold yourself on? Well, you better get a good grab on the reins right there. Hold on to the horse's mane. You really want to be careful. You might want to reach around the animal's neck. And if you have very strong legs, very strong knees, maybe hold yourself in a little bit. It takes a lot of skill. Native Americans, American Indians, were very, very good at riding without saddles. I would not try it. But now you have a means of staying on horseback, which is very valuable, of course, if you're going from point A to point B, you're riding various places. But it also becomes, the horse becomes a fighting platform. Rather now than relying on men on foot, you can have you can now fight on horseback. Of course, you need bigger breeds of horses, which take centuries to develop, because when you get a man on horseback and he starts wearing a lot of armor, he's very heavy. Of course, later on, you also have horses wearing armor, so you have to have a pretty tough animal to be able to let's get him on horseback. And these are late Middle Ages. Plate armor comes in quite late, and that's what these men are using. Good example, however, of armor on a horse, armor on the man. And notice he has a stirrup right here. Without the stirrup, it'd be impossible. It'd be impossible to ride the animal. Something else a stirrup will allow you to do, you can stand up in a stirrup, rather than being jiggled all over the place. You can stand up and let the animal, shall we say, essentially loop underneath you. So it's not just makes you more stable because you have a place to anchor yourself, but it makes you more stable because you don't have to be jostled in the same way the horse is. Let me try this one. Eagle Knights in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Love art, go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the more spectacular art museums in the United States. And it compares very favorably with some of the most spectacular art museums in the world. In the arms and armaments section, down the medieval section, they have a bunch of knights that are arrayed together. I believe there's 4. Let's count and see if I'm correct. That did not help. Try it one more time. Okay, I would like to show you a person standing nearby to give you proper sense of perspective. But notice in the late Middle Ages, we have all these men are using stirrups, armor on the horses, armor on them. Could you imagine what this would be like if you're a peasant, if you're an infantryman, and you're down there, and you got these guys running at you, and they drop their lances. Man, they mean business, and the throw power can be quite dramatic. I will argue later on that the peasants figure out a way of beating this, and that helps to free society. But you can see that now, when you do create a noble class, you're going to have wealthy people, and they do have the ability to fight well on horseback, which is brought to you largely by the stirrup. Stirrup stability, horse warfare. I mentioned the Avars. These are the first people who the straps came down. You put your big toe in that, and later on, of course, you have the modern stirrup, which is quite good. Well, okay. I talked about one of the factors earlier on. Remember Henri Pirenne, who believed that the destruction of medieval civilization was brought to you largely by the conquest of Islam. I believe that's strongly a factor. But another means by which civilization shifts from the Mediterranean is the use of all this technology, where you can have larger populations living in Britain, France, Germany, than had been the case before. You see, Rome occupies France for like 400 years. The population doesn't swing up very much at all. In the early Middle Ages, as you get all of these technical advances in place, then in reality now you have the opportunity to make an awful lot more progress and large populations. So where the population goes and where the wealth goes, civilization goes as well. So this is another factor in the advance of civilization. Well, let's take a look now. We're still in the early Middle Ages at one of the more important characters of the entire time frame. Let me take a look at Charlemagne. You say he's among the most important figures in the early Middle Ages. We can say that. We can also say he's very important in the entire scope of medieval history. We do believe some of these do somewhat accurately represent what he looked like. In his time frame, you do have the function of a state. As you and I think about the modern state, it tends to be the mechanisms of state. It is the tax collectors. It's the IRS who gets you to pay taxes. It's a police officer who pulls you over for speeding. It is the bureaucracy that helps you, that takes away your trash, that is involved in civic government. So we have all these mechanisms of the state in how everything is controlled. The difficulty is that at this time frame, even though Charlemagne is trying to create a state, after the fall of Rome, the I'll say it right, yeah, the mechanisms of state change. What I'm trying to say is this: having a physical presence, being a man with an armed retinue, being a man with an army, being a man who is physically dominant can make a big deal of difference. How big was this man? His corpse actually apparently still exists. I believe it was over 100 years ago. Some archaeologists got permission to go into his tomb, and they examined his corpse. Now, usually when men age, women too for that matter, we do have a tendency to get a little bit shorter in stature. I was asking my chiropractor about that once. He says, when do people start shrinking? He says in their 40s. I go, goodness. I passed my 40s a long time ago. I haven't shriveled up yet, but of course that's just a matter of time. Now, Charlemagne, for his time, he's old enough that he probably shriveled up some. How much, I don't know. In any event, they examined his corpse, and examining his bones, they said that he was roughly about 6'4" tall. By our standards, that's a pretty tall person. Not super tall, but it's pretty tall. Just recently in the Deseret News, they announced the most important people, according to Deseret News, of high school basketball players. And these are high school kids, juniors, mostly seniors. And not only they put down the number of points they made, they actually put down their height. And there was one junior in Utah, which I remember looking at. He's 6'10". That's a big kid. And since he's a junior in high school, he might still be growing. I would not mind having a piece of his pro contract because if he continues to increase his skills in basketball, he might have a career ahead of him. Most of these kids, however, were about 6'4". A few days ago, the Deseret News had women basketball players, and there was a woman, a high school basketball player, and she was 6'4". I remember when I used to swim down at the swimming pool at BYU, and that's back when Tina Gunn was a basketball player at BYU, and she was 6'5". Remember seeing her come out in a swimsuit, and I didn't know where the legs ended. They started the floor, and they went way up. She was a tall person. I guess I'm overstating this. By our standards, 6'4" is tall. By their standards, 6'4" was probably absolutely huge. Be more like 6'10" would be today. A person of that size clearly has physical presence. He was a strong man. He was a powerful man. He could dominate you by probably looking down the top of your head. One of the reasons why I find this so very amusing, his father was named Pepin the Short. Now, normally would think a man who's named the Short would have been short. And as you know, there's a tendency, very strong tendency, for our height to be inherited from our parents. Very tall parents, very tall kids. I don't know how tall Pepin the Short's mother was. Wife was. In other words, Charlemagne's mother. But I've always wondered, Pepin the Short, Charlemagne. Wonder if there's a little bit of something going on that hasn't been recorded. Can we say he's a very brutal man? Yes, we can. He doesn't like to fight in the wintertime. It's too cold, too much snow. For something like 35 years, almost every year, he's involved in campaigns. He tries to create an empire. But one of the ways he can really hold it together is really by military conquest. He liked education. He liked learning. He could read, but he couldn't write. Aren't those skills that are often taught at the same time? And the argument was we had a little hard time holding the pen. Well, let me give you the Winkler theory on this. People that are heavily involved in karate. And I'm not talking about people that are good with the moves. I'm talking about people who like to break boards. There are some people that like to break tile. And there are some people that have worked on this. Can I give you an example of that? Where you have people, probably not that have used their fists to the point where the knuckles get large. In fact, they're almost as large as an egg. Some of these people lose their dexterity. In other words, they have used their hands in such a manner so often and so heavily that in reality they have lost the ability to flex them. In other words, they could never play a musical instrument with these hands. That's the sacrifice they have made for the advance in their karate skills. I can't prove this, but I've actually wondered to a very real sense if Charlemagne did not use his hands, literally to the point, using weapons, using swords, using axes, he kept on using these to the point that he lost the dexterity enough to write. It's just a theory. But we say he could read, he knew languages, very brilliant man, but he, quite frankly, he could not write. Well, I'm getting a little too much detail on him, but I'm also running a little short on time. So let me break off at this point, and I'm going to say we'll go to Charlemagne, and the next point of discussion will be him going on the offensive against Islam, pushing the Moors back in the Mediterranean, which includes the enclave in Spain. And then once we've gone into that, we will talk into some of his other conquests and his importance in history. In the meantime, I hope everything's going very well with you. I hope you're all happy. I hope the weather is good. And I will speak to you again next time.